Outlaws Earned Grace. Susanna Carter had spent years fighting to keep her land safe from greedy cattlemen. But when Garrett Coulter rode onto her property, all quiet strength and smoldering eyes, she realized she was fighting the wrong battle. He crossed his arms, watching her. "You don't trust me, do you?" he murmured. "That's all right, sweetheart. I ain't askin' you to." Chapter 1. The Whispers of Dust and Regret. The wind, a ceaseless, whispering presence, carried the fine red dust of the Arizona Territory across the parched land, coating everything in a film of rust-colored regret. Susanna Carter stood on the weathered porch of her ranch house, her gaze fixed on the distant, shimmering horizon. 58 years she'd lived, and most of them had been spent battling this land, battling men who wanted to take it, battling the ghosts of her own past. The wind seemed to mock her, carrying whispers of what could have been, of what she'd lost. Her hands, rough and calloused from years of working the ranch, gripped the porch railing, the wood warm and familiar beneath her touch. The sun beat down, relentless and unforgiving, mirroring the relentless ache in her heart. She'd buried her husband, Thomas, 5 years ago. A good man, a strong man, but a man who'd never truly understood the fire that burned within her, the fierce independence that had both saved and isolated her. The ranch, the Carter spread, as it was known locally, was her lifeblood. It was more than just land, it was a legacy, a testament to her resilience, a shield against the world. Her father had carved it out of this unforgiving territory, and she'd fought tooth and nail to keep it. Cattle barons, greedy and ruthless, had tried to swallow it up, to add it to their sprawling empires. She'd faced them down, her Winchester rifle her most loyal companion. But the fight had taken its toll. The lines etched around her eyes, the silver threading through her once auburn hair, were not just marks of age, they were battle scars. Each one told a story of hardship, of defiance, of a loneliness that had settled deep in her bones. She'd become a creature of the land, as tough and unyielding as the ancient mesquite trees that dotted the landscape. A hawk circled overhead, its sharp cry echoing across the vast emptiness. Susanna watched it, a flicker of envy in her heart. The hawk was free, unburdened by the weight of responsibility, the shackles of the past. She, on the other hand, was tethered to this land, to the memory of her father, to the unspoken promise she'd made to him on his deathbed, to protect the Carter spread, no matter the cost. The cost had been high. She'd driven away suitors, men who'd seen her as a prize, a means to acquire her land. She'd learned to trust no one, to rely only on herself. The loneliness was a constant companion, a cold shadow that stretched long and dark across her life. She closed her eyes, letting the wind whip through her hair, carrying with it the scent of dust and sagebrush. The memories flooded back, unbidden and unwelcome. Her younger brother, Daniel, lost to a fever when he was just a boy. Her mother, fading away from grief, leaving Susanna alone with her stern, demanding father. The constant struggle, the endless work, the feeling that she was always just one step away from losing everything. A rider appeared on the horizon, a dark silhouette against the blazing sun. Susanna's hand instinctively moved towards the rifle leaning against the porch wall. She squinted, her eyes, though aged, still sharp and keen. The rider was coming closer, slowly, steadily. Not the hurried approach of a raiding party, but the deliberate pace of someone who knew where he was going. She felt a knot of unease tighten in her stomach. She hadn't had a visitor in weeks, not since the last cattle drive had passed through. She wasn't expecting anyone, and she certainly wasn't welcoming anyone. As the rider drew nearer, she could make out more details. A tall man, broad-shouldered, sitting easily in the saddle. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face, but she could see the glint of sunlight on a silver concho on his hatband. He rode a magnificent chestnut stallion, its coat gleaming in the sun. The unease grew stronger. This was no ordinary cowhand. This man exuded an air of authority, of confidence, that made her wary. She'd learned to recognize that look, the look of a man who was used to getting what he wanted. He reined in his horse at the edge of a yard, the dust swirling around the animal's hooves. He dismounted with a fluid grace, his movements economical and purposeful. He tied the reins to the hitching post, his eyes never leaving Susanna. She stood her ground, her hand still resting on the rifle. She wouldn't be intimidated. She'd faced down tougher men than this. He walked towards her, his boots crunching on the dry earth. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in her weathered appearance, her defiant stance. He removed his hat, revealing a face that was both rugged and handsome. Thick, dark hair, streaked with silver at the temples. Eyes that were the color of the desert sky after a storm. A deep, intense blue that seemed to see right through her. A strong jaw, shadowed by a few days' growth of beard. A face that had seen its share of hardship, but also held a hint of something else, a weariness, a vulnerability that she hadn't expected. He gave her a slow, deliberate nod. "Mrs. Carter, I presume?" His voice was low and gravelly, with a hint of a drawl that spoke of long days spent in the saddle. "Who's asking?" She replied, her voice tight and guarded. He didn't answer immediately, simply held her gaze. The silence stretched between them, filled only with the whispering wind and the distant cry of the hawk. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft, almost a murmur. "The name's Garrett Coulter." The name meant nothing to her, but the way he said it, the way he looked at her, sent a shiver down her spine. A premonition, perhaps, of a storm that was about to break over her carefully constructed world. A storm that would test her strength, her resolve, and her carefully guarded heart. She watched as a bead of sweat worked down the side of his face. She knew that look. She was looking at a mirror of herself. Chapter 2. A stranger's shadow on the horizon. The name still echoed in the dry air, hanging between them like the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun. Garrett Coulter. Susanna repeated it silently, testing the weight of it on her tongue, searching her memory for any connection, any hint of recognition. Nothing. But the unease remained, a persistent thrumming beneath her skin. "I don't know you," she stated, her voice flat, devoid of any welcome. Her hand remained near the Winchester, a silent warning. Coulter gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "No, ma'am, I don't expect you do. But I know of you, of the Carter spread." That sent a jolt of alarm through her. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice sharper now, her eyes narrowing. He held up his hands, palms open, in a gesture of peace. "No need to get your hackles up, Mrs. Carter. I ain't here to cause trouble. Every man who's ever ridden onto my land saying that has been lying," she retorted, her gaze unwavering. He let out a low chuckle, a sound that was surprisingly pleasant, despite the tension that crackled between them. "I reckon that's a fair assessment. But I ain't every man." His confidence, the quiet assurance in his voice, grated on her. She was used to men who blustered and threatened, men she could easily dismiss. This man, with his calm demeanor and his piercing blue eyes, was different. He was dangerous. "State your business, Mr. Coulter," she said, her voice firm. "I haven't got all day." He took a step closer, and she instinctively tensed, her hand tightening on the rifle. He stopped, respecting the unspoken boundaries she'd set. "I'm looking for work," he said simply. Susanna scoffed. "Work? On my ranch? I don't need any help." "Respectfully, ma'am, I think you do," he countered, his gaze sweeping across the sprawling ranch, taking in the signs of wear and tear, the evidence of a lone woman struggling to keep things running. The fences needed mending, the corral was in disrepair, and the cattle she'd glimpsed in the distance looked thin. She bristled at his unspoken assessment. "I've managed just fine on my own for years." "Maybe," he conceded, "but managing ain't the same as thriving. And from what I hear, the vultures are circling." She knew exactly what he meant. The vultures were the neighboring ranchers, the land-hungry men who'd been waiting for her to fail, to give up, to sell. They'd been patient, knowing that time and the elements were on their side. "What you hear is none of your concern," she said coldly. He shrugged. "Maybe not. But I'm a damn good ranch hand, Mrs. Carter. I know cattle, I know horses, and I know how to handle myself. I could be an asset to you. She studied him, trying to see through his carefully constructed facade. He was telling the truth. She could sense it. He was a good ranch hand. His calloused hands, his weathered face, his confident stance, all spoke of a life spent working the land. But that didn't mean she could trust him.
Why?
She asked, her voice suspicious. Why would you want to work for me? There are plenty of other ranches around, bigger ranches with more to offer. He met her gaze, his eyes unwavering. Let's just say I'm looking for a change of scenery. A place where a man can make a fresh start. His words resonated with her, echoing the longing she'd buried deep within her heart. The desire for a fresh start, for a life free from the burdens of the past. But she couldn't afford to be sentimental. She couldn't afford to trust a stranger. I don't hire strangers, she said, her voice hard. He smiled, a slow, easy smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Then I reckon we'll just have to get to know each other, won't we? He extended his hand towards her, a gesture of friendship, of truce. She hesitated, her instincts warring with a flicker of something else, a flicker of hope, perhaps, a desperate yearning for connection. She looked at his hand, rough and callous like her own, a hand that had known hard work and hardship. A hand that, for some inexplicable reason, she found herself wanting to trust. The wind whipped around them, carrying the scent of dust and the distant sound of cattle lowing. The sun beat down, casting long shadows across the yard. The hawk still circled overhead, a silent witness to the unfolding drama. Susanna took a deep breath, the air filling her lungs, a mixture of defiance and resignation. She knew she was taking a risk, a gamble. But she was tired of being alone, tired of fighting a losing battle. Slowly, reluctantly, she reached out and took his hand. His grip was firm and warm, sending a jolt of unexpected warmth through her. "All right, Mr. Coulter," she said, her voice still wary, but with a hint of something else, a hint of acceptance. "You've got yourself a job.
For now."
His eyes met hers again, a look passing between them. A look of what? Understanding? Possibly even respect. "That's all right, sweetheart," he murmured. "I ain't asking you to."
He tipped his hat to her.
"Just give me a chance to prove myself." And with that, the shadow of the stranger on the horizon began to take shape, to become a part of her life, a part of the Carter spread. Whether for good or ill, only time would tell. But one thing was certain, Susanna Carter's world had just shifted, and the whispers of dust and regret were about to be joined by a new, uncertain melody. She watched him stroll toward the stables, the epitome of a man at home in his own skin. A trait she always had admired, even if she'd never admit it. Chapter 3. The Weight of Unspoken Words. The first week passed in a blur of activity. Garrett Coulter proved to be everything he'd claimed and more. He was a tireless worker, rising before dawn and working until long after sunset. He mended fences, repaired the corral, doctored sick cattle, and even managed to fix the leaky roof on the bunkhouse, a task Susanna had been putting off for months. He didn't complain, didn't ask for anything, and didn't pry into her personal life. He was respectful, almost deferential, but there was a quiet strength about him, a sense of self-assurance that both intrigued and unnerved her. They worked side by side, often in silence, the only sounds the creak of leather, the thud of hooves, and the ever-present whisper of the wind. But even in silence, there was a growing awareness between them, an unspoken communication that transcended words. Susanna found herself watching him, studying him, trying to decipher the mystery that he was. He was a closed book, revealing little about his past, his motivations, his reasons for choosing to work on her isolated ranch. She noticed the small details, the way he handled a horse, with gentle firmness, the way he looked at the land, with a mixture of appreciation and understanding, the way he seemed to anticipate her needs, often before she even voiced them. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He was a man of the land, a man who understood the harsh realities of frontier life. A man who, despite his reticence, seemed to possess a deep well of empathy and compassion. One evening, after a long day of branding calves, they sat on the porch, sharing a simple meal of beans and cornbread. The sun had set, painting the sky in shades of orange, purple, and red. The air was cool and still, the silence broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. Susanna had grown accustomed to eating alone, to the silence of her own company. But with Garrett sitting across from her, the silence felt different. It wasn't empty, it was filled with a quiet presence, a sense of companionship that she hadn't realized she'd been craving. "You're good with cattle," she said, breaking the silence, her voice sounding surprisingly soft in the twilight. He looked up, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "Been around them all my life," he replied, his voice low and gravelly. "Where?" she asked, unable to resist the urge to probe, to learn more about him. He hesitated, his gaze drifting towards the horizon, as if searching for something in the fading light. "Here and there," he said vaguely. "Texas, mostly." She knew he was holding something back, deliberately avoiding giving her a straight answer. It frustrated her, but she also understood it. She was the same way, guarding her own secrets, her own past. "Texas is a big state," she pressed, gently. He gave a slight nod. "Big enough to get lost in." She sensed a sadness in his voice, a hint of regret that mirrored her own. She wondered what he was running from, what ghosts haunted him. "We all have things we'd rather forget," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to see into her soul. "That's the truth, ma'am," he said softly. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It was a shared silence, a silence of understanding, of unspoken empathy. They were two wounded souls, drawn together by the harsh realities of the frontier, by a shared need for solace, for connection. She found herself wanting to reach out to him, to offer him comfort, to tell him that he wasn't alone. But she held back, restrained by years of habit, by the fear of vulnerability. He finished his meal, then stood up, stretching his long limbs. "I'll check on the horses," he said, his voice matter-of-fact. "Thank you, Garrett," she said, her voice sincere. He paused, looking down at her, a hint of a smile on his lips. "It's my job, Mrs. Carter."
"I know," she replied.
"But I appreciate it." He nodded, then turned and walked towards the stables, his silhouette disappearing into the darkness. Susanna watched him go, feeling a strange mix of emotions, gratitude, curiosity, and a growing sense of unease. She knew she was playing with fire, allowing this stranger into her life, into her world. She knew she was taking a risk, trusting a man she barely knew. But she also knew that she couldn't keep fighting alone. She needed help, and Garrett Coulter, despite his mysterious past, seemed to be the answer to her prayers. Or perhaps a wolf in sheep clothes. But as she sat there on the porch, listening to the sounds of the night, she realized that she was no longer afraid. The loneliness that had been her constant companion for so long was beginning to recede, replaced by a flicker of hope, a glimmer of possibility. And as the weight of unspoken words hung heavy in the air, she knew that her life, and the fate of the Carter spread, was about to change forever. He had given her something that she hadn't even realized was missing. Quiet comfort. And she had returned it. The vast and star-studded sky stretched above, mirroring the enormity of the choices facing her. Chapter 4. Echoes of a Troubled Past. The following days settled into a comfortable rhythm. Garrett continued to impress Susanna with his tireless work ethic and his uncanny ability to anticipate her needs. He was a natural with the animals, calming skittish horses with a gentle touch and coaxing even the most stubborn cows into the corral. He seemed to understand the land, too, knowing where to find the best grazing, where to locate hidden springs, and how to read the subtle signs of an approaching storm. But despite the growing sense of ease between them, there was still a wall, an invisible barrier that prevented them from truly connecting. Garrett remained guarded, revealing little about his past, his motivations, or his reasons for seeking refuge on her isolated ranch. Susanna, too, held back, restrained by years of habit, by the fear of vulnerability. She'd learned the hard way that trust was a dangerous commodity, that opening herself up to others could lead to pain and betrayal. One afternoon, while they were mending a fence line, a sudden gust of wind whipped across the plains, carrying with it a cloud of dust and the distant rumble of thunder. "Storm's coming," Garrett said, his voice calm, his eyes scanning the horizon. "We should head back," Susanna replied, her voice tinged with anxiety. She hated storms. They reminded her of the night her father had died, a night of howling wind and torrential rain, a night that had changed her life forever. "We've got time," Garrett said, his voice reassuring. "Just a few more posts to set." He continued working, his movements efficient and purposeful. Susanna watched him, her anxiety growing with each passing moment. The sky was darkening rapidly, the wind was picking up, and the air was thick with the smell of ozone. Suddenly, a flash of lightning illuminated the sky, followed by a deafening clap of thunder. Susanna flinched, her heart pounding in her chest. Garrett stopped working and looked at her, his eyes filled with concern. "You all right?" he asked, his voice soft. "I don't like storms," she admitted, her voice trembling. He nodded, understandingly. "I know the feeling." He put down his tools and walked towards her, his presence a calming force in the midst of the gathering storm. He reached out and gently touched her arm, his touch sending a jolt of unexpected warmth through her. "We'll head back now," he said, his voice reassuring. "No need to worry." They gathered their tools and started walking back towards the ranch house, the wind whipping around them, the rain beginning to fall. The storm was upon them, a furious onslaught of wind, rain, and lightning. As they reached the shelter of the porch, another flash of lightning illuminated the sky, revealing a fleeting glimpse of Garrett's face. Susanna saw something in his eyes, a flicker of pain, a haunted look that mirrored her own. He saw her looking and quickly averted his gaze, his expression becoming guarded once more. But for that brief moment, she'd seen a glimpse of the man beneath the surface, the man who carried his own burdens, his own scars. They stood on the porch, watching the storm rage, the silence between them filled with unspoken emotions. Susanna felt a sudden urge to reach out to him, to ask him about his past, to share her own fears and vulnerabilities. But the words wouldn't come. The wall between them remained, reinforced by years of habit, by the fear of rejection, by the echoes of a troubled past. The storm eventually passed, leaving behind a trail of destruction and a sense of lingering unease. The air was clean and fresh, washed clean by the rain. The sky was a brilliant blue, dotted with fluffy white clouds. But the silence between Susanna and Garrett remained, heavier now, more profound. The echoes of their troubled pasts hung in the air, a reminder of the wounds they both carried, the secrets they both guarded. As Susanna watched the sun set, casting long shadows across the land, she knew that the storm had changed something between them. It had brought them closer, revealing a shared vulnerability, a shared understanding of pain and loss. But it had also reinforced the barriers between them, the walls they had built to protect themselves from further hurt. The echoes of the past were loud, and the path to true connection remained uncertain, shrouded in the shadows of unspoken words and unresolved fears. She needed to know. But how could she push without risking everything she had tried to build? Everything they had started to build. The silence between them hung thicker than the humid air after the downpour. Chapter 5. The Dance of Defiance and Desire. The unspoken tension between Susanna and Garrett lingered, a palpable presence that hung in the air like the aftermath of the storm. They continued to work together, their movements synchronized, their communication efficient, but there was an underlying current of awareness, a heightened sensitivity to each other's presence. Susanna found herself increasingly drawn to Garrett, intrigued by his quiet strength, his enigmatic nature, and the flashes of vulnerability she glimpsed beneath his guarded exterior. She caught herself watching him, admiring the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he seemed to embody the spirit of the untamed land. But she also resisted, fighting against the pull, reminding herself of the dangers of trust, the pain of past betrayals. She'd built a wall around her heart, a fortress of independence, and she wasn't sure she was ready to let anyone breach it. Garrett, too, seemed caught in a similar struggle. He was drawn to Susanna's resilience, her fierce spirit, and the quiet vulnerability she tried so hard to conceal. He found himself wanting to protect her, to ease her burdens, to break through the walls she'd erected around herself. But he also held back, restrained by his own demons, his own secrets, his own fear of repeating the mistakes of his past. He knew he was playing with fire, allowing himself to feel something for this woman, this ranch owner who had hired him out of necessity, not affection. One evening, after a long day of driving cattle to a distant pasture, they found themselves sitting around a campfire, the flames casting dancing shadows on their faces. The air was cool and crisp, the sky a vast expanse of stars. Susanna had prepared a simple meal of stew and biscuits, and they ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and the distant howl of a coyote. But the silence was charged with unspoken emotions, with a growing awareness of the attraction that simmered between them. "You're quiet tonight," Garrett said, breaking the silence, his voice low and gravelly. Susanna looked up, meeting his gaze. "So are you," she replied, her voice soft. He gave a slight nod. "Just thinking." "About what?" she asked, unable to resist the urge to probe. He hesitated, his gaze drifting towards the flames, as if searching for answers in the dancing fire. "About the past," he said finally, his voice tinged with regret. Susanna felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps he was finally ready to open up, to share his secrets, to let her in. "We all have things we regret," she said, echoing her words from a previous conversation. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "Some things are harder to forget than others," he said softly. She nodded, understandingly. "I know the feeling." The silence returned, but this time it was different. It was a shared silence, a silence of empathy, of two souls recognizing each other's pain. Susanna felt a sudden urge to reach out to him, to offer him comfort, to tell him that he wasn't alone. But she hesitated, restrained by her own fears, her own insecurities. He seemed to sense her hesitation, and he reached out and gently touched her hand, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. "Susanna," he said, his voice barely a whisper. She looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. The way he said her name, the tenderness in his voice, the longing in his eyes, sent shivers down her spine. He leaned closer, his face inches from hers. She could feel his breath on her skin, smell the scent of wood smoke and leather that clung to him. She knew she should pull away, should resist the temptation, should protect herself from the inevitable pain. But she couldn't. She was drawn to him, irresistibly, like a moth to a flame. Their lips met, softly at first, tentatively, then with increasing passion. It was a kiss that spoke of longing, of desire, of a shared need for connection. It was a kiss that shattered the walls they'd built, a kiss that ignited a fire that had been smoldering beneath the surface. But even as they kissed, a part of Susanna remained detached, observing, analyzing, questioning. Was this real? Was this genuine? Or was it just a fleeting moment of weakness, a temporary escape from the loneliness that had consumed them both? The dance of defiance and desire had begun, a delicate, dangerous dance between two wounded souls, each seeking solace, each fearing vulnerability. The fire had been lit, and the consequences remained unknown, shrouded in the shadows of the past and the uncertainties of the future. She tasted the loneliness on his lips and realized, with a start, that it mirrored her own. It tasted like coming home. Chapter 6. Scars Beneath the Surface. The kiss lingered in the air between them, a tangible presence that changed the dynamics of their relationship. They pulled apart, slightly breathless, their eyes locked in a gaze that spoke volumes. The world around them seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them, suspended in a moment of shared vulnerability and undeniable attraction. Susanna was the first to break the silence, her voice slightly shaky. "Garrett," he raised a hand, gently silencing her. "Don't," he said softly. "Don't say anything you'll regret." She understood. He was giving her an out, a chance to pretend it hadn't happened, to retreat back behind the walls she'd so carefully constructed.
But she didn't want to.
She was tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of denying the feelings that had been growing within her. "I don't regret it," she said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. He searched her eyes, looking for any sign of hesitation, any hint of doubt. He found none. A slow smile spread across his face, a smile that reached his eyes, transforming his rugged features into something softer, more approachable. "Neither do I," he said, his voice husky with emotion. The tension that had been building between them for weeks seemed to dissipate, replaced by a new kind of awareness, a sense of intimacy that went beyond the physical. They sat in silence for a while, simply enjoying each other's company, the warmth of the fire, the vastness of the starlit sky. The silence was no longer awkward or strained. It was comfortable, companionable, filled with a sense of unspoken understanding. Finally, Garrett spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. "I have things in my past," he said, his gaze drifting towards the flames. "Things I'm not proud of." Susanna nodded, her heart aching for him. "We all do, Garrett," she said softly. "It's what we do with those things that matters." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and pain. "I ran away," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "From my family, from my responsibilities, from myself." She reached out and gently touched his hand, her touch conveying empathy, understanding, and a silent offer of support.
"Why?"
she asked, her voice gentle. He hesitated, struggling to find the words. "It's a long story," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We have time," she replied, her gaze unwavering. He took a deep breath, then began to speak, his voice halting at first, then gaining strength as he delved into the painful memories he'd tried so hard to bury. He told her about his family, a wealthy ranching family in Texas, a family with a proud history and a dark secret. He told her about his father, a powerful, domineering man who had ruled his family with an iron fist. He told her about his brother, a reckless, irresponsible young man who had always been their father's favorite. He told her about a tragic accident, a cattle stampede that had resulted in the death of several ranch hands, an accident that his brother had caused, but that Garrett had taken the blame for. He told her about the guilt, the shame, the feeling of betrayal that had driven him to leave everything behind, to seek refuge in anonymity, to try to outrun his past. Susanna listened, her heart aching for him, her own past traumas resonating with his story. She understood the weight of guilt, the burden of responsibility, the desire to escape from a life that had become unbearable. As he spoke, she saw the scars beneath the surface, the wounds that had never fully healed, the pain that he carried with him every day. And she realized that she was not alone in her own struggles, that they were both survivors, both carrying the burdens of a troubled past. When he finished speaking, the silence returned, but this time it was different. It was a silence of shared pain, of shared understanding, of a bond forged in the crucible of adversity. Susanna reached out and took his hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "Thank you for telling me," she said, her voice sincere. He looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you for listening," he replied, his voice husky with emotion. They sat together, hand in hand, their silence speaking volumes. The scars beneath the surface were still there, but they were no longer hidden, no longer a source of shame. They were a testament to their resilience, their strength, their ability to survive. The weight hadn't lifted, not completely, but the night, and the story, and the unspoken needs bound them closer. She had finally begun to understand. And as the fire died down, casting long shadows across the land, they knew that their journey together had just begun. He wasn't hers, not yet. But he would be. Chapter 7. The Unforgiving Glare of Truth. The revelation of Garrett's past created a shift in their relationship, a deepening of trust and intimacy. They began to share more of themselves, their hopes, their fears, their dreams. Susanna, in turn, opened up about her own life, her struggles, her losses. She told him about her father, a hard man who'd taught her everything she knew about ranching, but who'd also instilled in her a deep-seated fear of failure. She told him about her husband, Thomas, a good man, but one who never truly understood her independent spirit. She told him about the constant battle to keep the ranch afloat, the threats from neighboring ranchers, the loneliness that had become her constant companion. Garrett listened patiently, offering quiet support, understanding, and a shoulder to lean on. He never judged, never criticized, never tried to fix her. He simply accepted her, flaws and all. As they shared their stories, they discovered a shared passion for the land, for the simple life, for the freedom that came with living on the frontier. They spent hours riding together, exploring the vast expanse of the Carter Spread, discovering hidden canyons, ancient Indian ruins, and breathtaking vistas. They worked side by side, their movements synchronized, their communication effortless. They were a team, a partnership, bound together by a shared love for the land and a growing affection for each other. But the outside world was beginning to intrude. Word of Garrett's presence on the Carter Spread had reached the ears of Jedediah Stone, the owner of the neighboring ranch and Susanna's most persistent and ruthless adversary. Stone had been waiting for years for an opportunity to acquire the Carter Spread, and he saw Garrett as a potential threat, a wild card that could disrupt his plans. One afternoon, while Susanna and Garrett were repairing a fence line, Stone rode up with two of his men, his face set in a grim expression. "Mrs. Carter," Stone said, his voice cold and menacing, "I see you've hired yourself a new hand." Susanna met his gaze, her eyes narrowed. "That's right, Stone. And he's a damn good one." Stone's eyes flickered to Garrett, assessing him with a calculating gaze. "Heard he's a Texan. An outsider." "He's a ranch hand," Susanna retorted, her voice firm. "And he's none of your concern." Stone chuckled, a sound that was devoid of any humor. "Everything that happens in this valley is my concern, Mrs. Carter, especially when it involves my neighbors." He dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, and walked towards Garrett, his two men flanking him. "What's your name, Texan?" Stone asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Garrett met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "Coulter," he replied, his voice calm. "Garrett Coulter." Stone's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "Coulter, I've heard that name before." Garrett remained silent, his body tense, his hand hovering near the gun on his hip. Stone turned back to Susanna, his eyes filled with a mixture of suspicion and malice. "You'd best be careful who you trust, Mrs. Carter. Some men have a past they'd rather keep hidden." He mounted his horse, then turned back to Garrett, his gaze lingering on him for a moment longer. "I'll be watching you, Coulter," he said, his voice a threat. Then he spurred his horse and rode away, his two men following close behind. Susanna and Garrett watched them go, the silence heavy with unspoken tension. The unforgiving glare of truth had been cast upon them, revealing the dangers that lay ahead. "He knows," Garrett said, his voice low and grim.
"He knows something."
Susanna nodded, her heart filled with a growing sense of dread. "He's a dangerous man, Garrett. He won't give up." "Neither will I," Garrett replied, his voice firm, his eyes filled with determination. They stood together, facing the unknown, their bond strengthened by the shared threat. The dance of defiance and desire had taken a new turn, a darker, more dangerous turn. The stakes had been raised, and the consequences of their choices were about to become clear. She knew this wouldn't be the last. The dust kicked up from Stone's departure settled slowly, like a premonition of things to come. Chapter 8. A storm brewing on the plains. The encounter with Jedediah Stone cast a long shadow over the Carter Spread. The uneasy peace that Susanna and Garrett had found was shattered, replaced by a sense of impending danger. They knew that Stone wouldn't let the matter rest, that he would use Garrett's past against them, that he would do everything in his power to acquire the ranch. They continued to work, to prepare, to strengthen their defenses, but the threat loomed large, a constant reminder of the precariousness of their situation. They spoke less, their conversations punctuated by long silences, their eyes filled with a mixture of worry and determination. The weather seemed to mirror their mood, the clear, sunny days replaced by dark, ominous clouds. A storm was brewing, both literally and figuratively. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the lightning flash in the distance, Susanna spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "What are we going to do, Garrett?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. "We'll fight," he said simply. "We'll fight for what's ours." She nodded, her heart aching with a mixture of fear and admiration.
She knew he was right.
They had no other choice. They had to fight, not just for the ranch, but for their future, for their chance at happiness. But she also knew that the odds were stacked against them. Stone was a powerful man, with connections, resources, and a ruthless determination to get what he wanted. He wouldn't hesitate to use any means necessary, including violence, to achieve his goals. The next day, the storm broke, a furious onslaught of wind, rain, and lightning. The ranch was plunged into darkness, the wind howling like a banshee, the rain lashing against the windows. Susanna and Garrett huddled inside the ranch house, listening to the storm rage, their nerves on edge. They knew that Stone might use the storm as cover, as an opportunity to attack. Suddenly, they heard a loud banging on the door, a frantic, desperate pounding. Garrett grabbed his rifle, his body tense, his eyes alert. "Who is it?" he shouted, his voice loud enough to be heard above the storm. A muffled voice replied, "It's me, Billy. Billy from the Miller place." Garrett recognized the voice. Billy was a young boy who lived on a small homestead a few miles away. Garrett cautiously opened the door, his rifle ready. Billy stumbled inside, soaked to the bone, his face pale with fear. "Mr. Coulter, Mrs. Carter," he gasped. "You gotta help us. Stone's men, they're raiding our place. They're stealing our cattle, and they shot my pa."
Susanna's heart sank.
This was it. The storm had arrived, not just in the form of the weather, but in the form of Jedediah Stone's ruthless ambition. Garrett's face was grim, his eyes filled with a cold fury. "How many?" he asked, his voice tight. "For maybe 5, Billy replied, his voice trembling. "They're armed, and they're mean." Garrett turned to Susanna, his eyes meeting hers. "Stay here," he said, his voice firm. "Protect the ranch. I'll go help Billy's family." Susanna wanted to protest, to tell him it was too dangerous, to beg him to stay. But she knew he wouldn't listen. He was a man of honor, a man who would always stand up for what was right, even if it meant risking his own life. She looked at Billy, at the raw fear in his eyes. She made her choice in that split second. "I'm going with you," she said, her voice resolute. He started to object, but she cut him off.
"Don't argue with me, Garrett.
"I can handle a rifle. And I won't let you face them alone." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of respect and concern. He knew he couldn't dissuade her. She was as stubborn and determined as he was. He nodded, his expression grim. "All right," he said. "Let's go." They grabbed their rifles, their coats, and their hats, and stepped out into the storm, the wind and rain buffeting them, the lightning illuminating their determined faces. The storm was raging, and the battle had begun. The door slammed shut behind them, echoing the finality of their decision in the howling wind. Chapter 9. The Price of Loyalty and Betrayal. The ride to the Miller homestead was treacherous, the wind and rain making it difficult to see, the mud slowing their progress. Susanna and Garrett rode side by side, their bodies hunched against the storm, their rifles held ready. Billy, riding double with Garrett, clung to him tightly, his small body trembling with fear and cold. As they approached the Miller place, they could hear the sounds of chaos, the shouts of men, the terrified cries of animals, the crackle of gunfire. The scene that greeted them was one of devastation. The fences were torn down, the barn was on fire, and the cattle were scattered, running wild in the storm. Garrett reined in his horse, his eyes scanning the scene, assessing the situation. He spotted 4 men, Stone's men, rounding up the remaining cattle, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames of the burning barn. "Stay here with Billy," Garrett said to Susanna, his voice low and urgent.
Keep him safe.
I'll try to draw them away. Susanna nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew he was right. He was the better shot, the more experienced fighter. She had to trust him, to let him do what he did best. Garrett spurred his horse forward, charging towards the raiders, his rifle blazing. He fired a shot, deliberately missing, aiming to get their attention. The raiders turned, surprised, and returned fire. Garrett ducked behind a water trough, using it as cover. He fired another shot, this time hitting one of the men in the shoulder. The man screamed in pain, dropping his rifle. The other 3 raiders turned their attention to Garrett, firing wildly. Garrett continued to fire, moving from cover to cover, drawing them further away from the homestead, giving Susanna and Billy a chance to escape. Meanwhile, Susanna, hiding behind a clump of trees with Billy, watched the gunfight unfold, her heart in her throat. She wanted to help, to join the fight, but she knew she had to stay put to protect Billy. Suddenly, she saw one of the raiders break away from the others and head towards the Miller house. She realized with a jolt of horror that he was going after Mrs. Miller and her young daughter, who were still hiding inside. Susanna knew she couldn't let that happen. She had to act, to protect the innocent. She handed Billy her rifle, telling him to stay hidden and to shoot only if he had to. Then she crept towards the house, moving stealthily, using the cover of the storm and the darkness. She reached the back door, cautiously peering inside. She saw the raider, his back to her, searching the house, his rifle held ready. She took a deep breath, steeled her nerves, and burst inside, surprising the raider. "Get out!" she shouted, her voice fierce and commanding. The raider turned, startled, and raised his rifle. But Susanna was faster. She swung the butt of her rifle, hitting him hard on the side of the head. The raider staggered, dropping his rifle, and fell to the floor, unconscious. Susanna quickly grabbed his rifle, then turned to Mrs. Miller and her daughter, who were huddled in a corner, their faces pale with fear. "Are you all right?" Susanna asked, her voice urgent. Mrs. Miller nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved us." Susanna helped them out of the house, leading them towards the trees where Billy was hiding. Meanwhile, Garrett continued to fight, holding off the remaining raiders, but he was outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of ammunition. He knew he couldn't hold them off much longer. He was about to be overrun, captured, or killed. Suddenly, he heard a familiar voice, a voice that filled him with a surge of hope and relief. Garrett. It was Susanna. She had returned, bringing with her a renewed sense of determination and a willingness to fight alongside him. The price of loyalty was steep, but the betrayal of inaction was far steeper. They had to keep their aim. They had to stay alive. The dawn would reveal how they had managed. The sound of gunfire echoed across the ravaged homestead, punctuated by the cries of the wounded and the relentless fury of the storm. Chapter 10. Broken Trusts and Fragile Hopes. The arrival of Susanna, rifle in hand, shifted the balance of the fight. Though still outnumbered, Garrett felt a surge of renewed strength, a fierce determination fueled by her presence. They fought back to back, covering each other, their movements synchronized by years of working the land and a newfound understanding forged in the crucible of danger. One of the raiders, seeing his comrade fall to Susanna, charged at her, rage burning in his eyes. Garrett, with lightning reflexes, shot him down before he could reach her. The remaining 2 raiders, realizing they were outmatched, hesitated, their confidence wavering. They exchanged a look, a silent communication that spoke of fear and desperation. "Let's get out of here," one of them shouted, his voice trembling. They turned and fled, disappearing into the storm, leaving behind their fallen comrades and their failed attempt to steal the Miller's cattle. Garrett and Susanna stood panting, their bodies aching, their clothes soaked, their faces grim. The storm still raged, but the immediate threat had passed. They checked on the wounded raider Susanna had knocked unconscious. He was still alive, but badly injured. They tied him up, intending to turn him over to the authorities, if there were any left who weren't in Stone's pocket. They then went to check on the Millers. Mr. Miller was alive, but seriously wounded. Mrs. Miller and her daughter were shaken but unharmed. Susanna and Garrett helped them tend to Mr. Miller's wounds, doing their best to comfort them. The barn was a smoldering ruin, the cattle scattered, but the house, miraculously, had been spared. As the storm began to subside, the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds, casting a pale, ethereal light on the ravaged homestead. The scene was one of devastation, but also of resilience. The Millers, despite their losses, were grateful to be alive. They thanked Susanna and Garrett profusely, their eyes filled with tears of gratitude. "You saved our lives," Mrs. Miller said, her voice trembling. "We'll never forget what you did." Garrett and Susanna exchanged a look, a silent communication that spoke of shared sacrifice, shared courage, and a deepening bond. They helped the Millers salvage what they could, then rode back to the Carter spread, their bodies exhausted, their spirits weary, but their hearts filled with a sense of quiet satisfaction. They had faced the storm, both literally and figuratively, and they had survived. They had stood up to Jedediah Stone and his ruthless ambition, and they had won, at least for now. But they also knew that the battle was far from over. Stone wouldn't give up easily. He would be back, angrier, more determined than ever. As they reached the ranch house, they saw a sight that made their hearts sink. A note was nailed to the door, a crudely scrawled message that sent a chill down their spines. "You can't win, Carter. This land is mine. You and your Texan are dead." The note was signed with a single initial, S. The fragile hopes they had nurtured were threatened, the broken trusts of the past resurfacing in the present. They had won a battle, but the war was far from over. And they knew, with a sickening certainty, that Stone's next move would be even more brutal, more personal. He had made this a reckoning.
They steeled themselves for the worst,
knowing that the worst had yet to reveal itself. Susanna looked at Garrett. She had never seen that kind of cold fire in a man's eyes. Nor had she felt so sure of her safety, standing next to him. The silence that followed was broken only by the dripping of the rain from the eaves, each drop a somber reminder of the precariousness of their situation. Chapter 11. Beneath a sky of endless stars. The ominous note left a heavy silence hanging over the Carter spread. The victory at the Miller homestead felt hollow, overshadowed by the looming threat of Jedediah Stone's revenge. Susanna and Garrett knew they were living on borrowed time, that Stone would strike again, and that they had to be prepared. They spent the following days fortifying the ranch, repairing fences, checking weapons, and keeping a constant watch. They slept in shifts, taking turns guarding the house and the remaining cattle. They were exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but they couldn't afford to let their guard down. Despite the tension and the fear, there were moments of quiet intimacy, moments when they found solace in each other's company. They shared meals, worked side by side, and talked about their hopes and dreams, their fears and regrets. One evening, after a long day of work, they found themselves sitting on the porch, watching the sunset. The sky was a breathtaking canvas of color, shades of orange, pink, and purple blending seamlessly together. "It's beautiful," Susanna said, her voice soft, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Garrett nodded, his eyes following hers. "It is," he agreed. "Makes you forget, for a moment, all the troubles in the world." They sat in silence for a while, simply enjoying the beauty of the moment, the peace and tranquility that seemed so far removed from the dangers that surrounded them. "I've been thinking," Susanna said, breaking the silence, "about what Stone said, about this land being his." Garrett looked at her, his expression questioning. "My father always told me stories," she continued, "about how he acquired this land, how he fought for it, how he built this ranch from nothing." She paused, her voice tinged with sadness. "But there were always whispers, rumors that he wasn't entirely honest in his dealings, that he may have taken this land from someone else." Garrett's eyes widened slightly, surprised by her admission. "Do you believe it?" he asked. She shrugged, her expression uncertain.
"I don't know," she said.
"But it's been bothering me. What if Stone is right? What if what if it doesn't truly belong to me? Garrett reached out and gently took her hand, his touch sending a jolt of warmth through her. It doesn't matter, he said, his voice firm. What matters is what we do with it now. What matters is that we fight for it, that we protect it, that we make it something to be proud of. She looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. He always knew the right thing to say, the right way to ease her doubts, to strengthen her resolve. Thank you, Garrett, she said, her voice sincere. He smiled, a slow, easy smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. For what? He asked. For being here, she replied. For standing by me. For believing in me. He leaned closer, his face inches from hers. I'll always be here, Susanna, he said, his voice husky with emotion. Always. Their lips met, a soft, tender kiss that spoke of love, of loyalty, of a shared commitment to each other and to the land. It was a kiss that sealed their bond, a kiss that promised a future together, a future they would fight for, no matter the cost. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky transformed into a vast expanse of stars, a million points of light shimmering in the darkness. They sat together, hand in hand, beneath the endless sky, their hearts filled with a mixture of hope and fear, of love and uncertainty. They knew the road ahead would be difficult, that they would face many challenges, that their future was far from certain. But they also knew that they were not alone, that they had each other, and that as long as they stood together, they could face anything. The hope was a fragile flame. The vastness of the starry sky, usually a source of comfort, now seemed to emphasize their vulnerability, their insignificance in the face of the looming threat. And they held on, the fire still burning. Chapter 12. The Tangled Roots of Family Secrets. The unsettling possibility of her father's past misdeeds gnawed at Susanna. Garrett's words of support had offered comfort, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and it grew with each passing day. She needed answers, needed to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. She began to search through her father's old belongings, dusty boxes and trunks stored in the attic, remnants of a life she had only partially known. She sifted through old letters, receipts, ledgers, and maps, hoping to find some clue, some evidence that would shed light on the origins of the Carter spread. It was a slow, painstaking process, filled with moments of frustration and disappointment. Most of the documents were mundane, records of cattle sales, supply orders, and weather reports. But occasionally, she would stumble upon something that piqued her interest, a cryptic note, a faded photograph, a name she didn't recognize. One afternoon, while searching through a particularly old and battered trunk, she found a small, leather-bound journal. The cover was worn and cracked, the pages yellowed and brittle. She carefully opened it, her heart pounding with anticipation. It was her father's journal, his personal account of his early years on the frontier, his struggles, his ambitions, his dreams. She began to read, her eyes scanning the faded handwriting, her mind absorbing the words of a man she thought she knew, but was now beginning to question. As she read, a disturbing picture began to emerge. Her father, it seemed, had not been the entirely honorable man she had always believed him to be. He had been ambitious, ruthless, and willing to do whatever it took to achieve his goals. He had made enemies, cheated business partners, and most disturbingly, had been involved in a land dispute with a Mexican family, the Morales family, who had claimed ownership of the very land that now formed the heart of the Carter spread. Susanna's heart sank as she read the details of the dispute, the threats, the intimidation, the eventual disappearance of the Morales family. Her father's journal didn't explicitly state that he had been responsible for their disappearance, but the implication was clear. She closed the journal, her hands trembling, her mind reeling. The truth was worse than she had imagined. Her father, the man she had idolized, the man who had taught her everything she knew, had been a liar, a cheat, and possibly even a murderer. She felt a wave of nausea, a sense of betrayal that cut her to the core. The land she had fought so hard to protect, the legacy she had sworn to uphold, was built on a foundation of lies and deceit. She didn't know what to do, who to turn to. She felt lost, alone, adrift in a sea of doubt and confusion. She found Garrett in the stables, tending to the horses. He saw the look on her face, the pain in her eyes, and immediately knew something was wrong. "Susanna? What is it?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. She handed him the journal, her hand trembling. "Read it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Read it and tell me what you think." He took the journal, his brow furrowed, and began to read. She watched him, her heart aching, waiting for his reaction, his judgment. As he read, his expression changed, from curiosity to concern to a grim understanding. He finished reading, then closed the journal, his gaze meeting hers. "I'm sorry, Susanna," he said softly. "I know this must be difficult." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "What do I do, Garrett?" she asked, her voice pleading. "What do I do with this truth?" She gestured wildly, at the ranch, at the journal, at the entire world around them. He reached out and gently took her hands, his touch calming and reassuring. "You do what's right," he said, his voice firm. "You find out what happened to the Morales family. And you make amends if you can." He was her rock. And she finally knew that he always would be. It was a daunting task, a seemingly impossible one. But she knew she had to try. She had to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. She had to face the past, to make peace with it, to build a future based on honesty and justice. And she knew, with a certainty that warmed her heart, that Garrett would be there with her, every step of the way. The tangled roots of family secrets had been exposed, and the path forward, though uncertain, was now illuminated by a commitment to truth and a shared determination to right the wrongs of the past. Chapter 13. A Reckoning at the Heart of the Storm. Armed with the unsettling revelations from her father's journal, Susanna and Garrett embarked on a quest to uncover the truth about the Morales family and their connection to the Carter spread. They knew it wouldn't be easy, that they would face resistance, that they might uncover secrets that some people would rather keep buried. They started by searching for any records of the Morales family, land deeds, court documents, anything that could shed light on their claim to the land. They visited the local courthouse, a dilapidated building that housed the fragmented history of the territory, but found little of substance. The records were incomplete, disorganized, and often deliberately misleading. They spoke to some of the older residents of the area, hoping to find someone who remembered the Morales family, who could offer some insight into their disappearance. But most people were either unwilling or unable to help, their memories clouded by time, fear, or a deliberate desire to forget. Just as they were beginning to lose hope, they encountered an old Mexican woman, Elena, who lived in a small adobe house on the outskirts of town. Elena was ancient, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes filled with a wisdom that came from a long and difficult life. At first, Elena was reluctant to talk, her eyes wary, her voice hesitant. But Susanna, with her gentle persistence and her sincere desire to learn the truth, managed to gain her trust. Elena told them the story of the Morales family, a proud and hard-working family who had lived on the land for generations, long before the arrival of the American settlers. She told them about how Susanna's father, driven by greed and ambition, had systematically harassed and intimidated them, trying to force them off their land. She told them about the threats, the violence, the eventual disappearance of the entire family. She didn't know exactly what had happened to them, but she suspected foul play, and she pointed the finger squarely at Susanna's father. Elena's story confirmed Susanna's worst fears. Her father had been a cruel and ruthless man, and he had stolen the land that she now called home. The revelation was a heavy burden, a weight of guilt and shame that settled upon her shoulders. But it also strengthened her resolve. She had to make things right, to atone for her father's sins, to restore justice to the Morales family, if they could ever find them or any living kin. As they were leaving Elena's house, a group of riders approached, led by none other than Jedediah Stone. Stone's face was set in a grim expression, his eyes filled with a cold fury. "I warned you, Carter," Stone said, his voice menacing. "I warned you to stay out of my business." Susanna met his gaze, her eyes filled with defiance. This isn't your business, Stone, she retorted. This is about justice. About righting a wrong. Stone chuckled, a sound that was devoid of any humor. Justice? There's no justice in this valley, Carter. Only power. And I have the power. He signaled to his men, and they surrounded Susanna and Garrett, their rifles drawn. You're going to regret crossing me, Carter, Stone said, his voice dripping with malice. You and your Texan friend. Garrett stepped forward, his hand hovering near his gun. Leave her alone, Stone, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Stone smiled, a cruel, predatory smile. I don't think so, Coulter, he said. I think it's time you learned a lesson. A tense standoff ensued, the air thick with anticipation. The reckoning had arrived, a confrontation at the heart of the storm, a battle between good and evil, between justice and greed. The outcome remained uncertain, the odds stacked against Susanna and Garrett. But they stood together, their backs against the wall, their hearts filled with a fierce determination to fight for what was right, no matter the cost. The sky had begun to cloud. The silence was broken only by the snorting of the horses and the heavy breathing of the men, a prelude to the violence that was about to erupt. Chapter 14. The bitter taste of sacrifice. The standoff reached its breaking point. One of Stone's men, younger and more impulsive than the others, twitched, his finger tightening on the trigger of his rifle. Garrett, anticipating the move, reacted instantly, drawing his gun and firing. The shot rang out, echoing across the dusty landscape. The young man cried out in pain, dropping his rifle, clutching his arm. The other men, startled by the sudden burst of violence, hesitated for a moment, their eyes darting between Garrett and Stone. Stone, enraged by Garrett's defiance, roared, "Kill them!" The men raised their rifles, aiming at Susanna and Garrett. A gunfight erupted, a chaotic exchange of gunfire that filled the air with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the cries of the wounded. Susanna and Garrett, outnumbered and outgunned, fought with a desperate courage, using their skills and their knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. They moved from cover to cover, firing with accuracy and precision, their movements synchronized by years of working together. But the odds were against them. Stone's men were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. One by one, Susanna and Garrett's defenses began to crumble. Garrett was hit, a bullet grazing his shoulder, sending a searing pain through his body. He staggered, but managed to stay on his feet, his grip on his rifle tightening. Susanna, seeing Garrett wounded, cried out in alarm, her heart filled with fear. She rushed to his side, shielding him with her body, firing at the approaching men. "Garrett, are you all right?" she asked, her voice urgent. He nodded, his face grim, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "I'm fine," he said, his voice strained. "Just a scratch." But she knew he was lying. The wound was serious, and he was losing blood. They were trapped, cornered, with no escape in sight. Stone, seeing his opportunity, advanced towards them, his face twisted with a mixture of triumph and malice. "It's over, Carter," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "You've lost. This land is mine." Susanna met his gaze, her eyes filled with defiance. "Never," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "This land doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the people who were wronged, to the Morales family." Stone laughed, a cruel, mocking laugh. "The Morales family? They're gone, dead and buried. And soon you'll be too." He raised his rifle, aiming at Susanna. Garrett, seeing the imminent threat, reacted instinctively. He pushed Susanna aside, placing himself between her and Stone's rifle. The shot rang out, a deafening blast that echoed across the valley. Garrett cried out in pain, his body jerking violently. He staggered, then collapsed to the ground, his eyes fixed on Susanna. Susanna screamed, a heart-wrenching cry of anguish and despair. She rushed to Garrett's side, cradling his head in her lap, tears streaming down her face.
"Garrett, no, please,"
she pleaded, her voice choked with sobs. He looked at her, his eyes filled with love and regret. I had to, he whispered, his voice weak. I couldn't let him hurt you. His eyes closed, his breathing stopped. He was gone.
Susanna's world shattered.
The man she loved, the man who had stood by her, the man who had sacrificed himself to save her, was dead. The bitter taste of sacrifice filled her mouth, a taste of loss, of grief, of despair. But amidst the pain, a new resolve began to harden within her. She would not let Garrett's sacrifice be in vain. She would fight on for him, for justice, for the future. This was not over. Stone looked at her, not with malice, but almost a kind of twisted respect. The storm that had been brewing for so long had finally broken, and the consequences were devastating. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Susanna's sobs and the distant rumble of thunder, a somber lament for the fallen hero. Chapter 15. Where the river bends towards destiny. Susanna remained kneeling beside Garrett's lifeless body, her grief a raw, gaping wound. The world around her seemed to fade away, leaving only the emptiness, the pain, the crushing weight of loss. Stone and his men, their bloodlust momentarily sated, watched her from a distance, their faces devoid of emotion. But even in her despair, a flicker of defiance remained, a spark of determination that refused to be extinguished. Garrett's sacrifice had ignited a fire within her, a fierce resolve to carry on, to fight for justice, to honor his memory. She gently closed Garrett's eyes, her fingers tracing the lines of his face, etching his image into her memory. She whispered a silent promise, a vow to avenge his death, to make Stone pay for his crimes, to reclaim her life and her land. She stood up, her legs shaky, her body trembling, but her eyes filled with a newfound strength. She looked at Stone, her gaze unwavering, her voice filled with a quiet intensity. "You may have killed him," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "But you haven't won. I will never give up. I will fight you until my last breath." Stone scoffed, his expression dismissive. "You're nothing, Carter," he said. "Just a broken old woman. You have nothing left to fight with." He turned to his men, signaling them to leave. They mounted their horses, their faces grim, their eyes avoiding Susanna's gaze. As they rode away, Susanna watched them, her heart filled with a mixture of hatred and determination. She would find a way, somehow, to make them pay. She spent the rest of the day burying Garrett, choosing a spot beneath a sprawling mesquite tree, a place where he had often sought solace, a place that overlooked the vast expanse of the Carter spread. She dug the grave herself, her hands blistered and bleeding, her tears mingling with the sweat and the soil. As she lowered his body into the ground, she whispered a final farewell, a promise to keep his memory alive, to carry on his legacy, to fight for the future they had dreamed of together. After burying Garrett, Susanna returned to the ranch house, her steps heavy, her heart aching. She felt lost, alone, adrift in a sea of grief. But she knew she couldn't give in to despair. She had a responsibility, a duty, to carry on. She remembered Elena, the old Mexican woman who had told her the story of the Morales family. She decided to seek her out again, to ask for her help, to learn more about the past, to find a way to right the wrongs that had been committed. She rode to Elena's house, her heart heavy with sorrow, but her spirit filled with a renewed sense of purpose. Elena greeted her with a sad smile, her eyes filled with understanding. "I heard what happened," Elena said, her voice soft. "I'm sorry for your loss." Susanna nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "He was a good man, Elena," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "He died protecting me." Elena reached out and gently took Susanna's hand, her touch comforting and reassuring. "He was a hero," Elena said, "and his sacrifice will not be forgotten." Susanna told Elena about her determination to find the Morales family, to make amends for her father's sins, to restore justice to those who had been wronged. Elena listened patiently, her eyes filled with wisdom and compassion.
"It won't be easy," she said.
"The past is a tangled web, and some secrets are best left buried. But I have to try," Susanna said, her voice firm. "I have to do what's right." Elena nodded, her expression approving.
I will help you, she said.
I know some things that might help you find the Morales family or their descendants. Elena told Susanna about a rumor, a whisper of a story that had been passed down through generations. The rumor spoke of a hidden valley, a place where the Morales family had sought refuge after being driven from their land. They say the valley is protected, Elena said. Hidden from the outside world. Only those who know the way can find it. Elena gave Susanna directions, a cryptic set of landmarks and clues that would lead her to the hidden valley. Follow the river, Elena said, where it bends towards destiny. There you will find what you seek. Susanna thanked Elena, her heart filled with a flicker of hope. She knew the journey would be difficult, that she would face many challenges, but she was determined to follow the river, to find the hidden valley, to uncover the truth. She had found a thread of possibility. The river, a symbol of life and renewal, now represented a path towards redemption, a journey to heal the wounds of the past and build a future based on justice and reconciliation. The fate had been sealed. Chapter 16. The Echo of Gunfire and Redemption. Following Elena's cryptic directions, Susanna set out on a solitary journey, her heart heavy with grief, but fueled by a fierce determination to find the hidden valley and the descendants of the Morales family. She rode for days, following the winding river, navigating treacherous terrain, her senses alert to any sign, any clue that might lead her closer to her goal. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, a vast expanse of desert, canyons, and mesas. The sun beat down relentlessly, the wind whipped across the plains, and the nights were cold and lonely. But Susanna pressed on, her spirit unbroken, her resolve strengthened by the memory of Garrett and her commitment to justice. She encountered obstacles along the way, wild animals, treacherous trails, and the constant threat of discovery by Stone's men. But she persevered, using her skills and her knowledge of the land to overcome the challenges, her determination unwavering. As she followed the river, she began to notice subtle changes in the landscape. The vegetation became more lush, the air cooler and moister, and the sounds of wildlife more abundant. She sensed she was getting closer, that the hidden valley was within reach. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the land, she came to a place where the river bent sharply, forming a narrow gorge. The walls of the gorge were steep and rocky, covered in dense vegetation. She remembered Elena's words, "Follow the river, where it bends towards destiny." She dismounted, her heart pounding with anticipation, and cautiously entered the gorge, her rifle held ready. The air was still and quiet, the only sounds the rushing water and the distant cry of a hawk. As she rounded a bend, she gasped in astonishment. Before her lay a hidden valley, a lush oasis of green nestled amidst the harsh desert landscape. It was a breathtaking sight, a secret paradise hidden from the outside world. She saw fields of crops, grazing animals, and small adobe houses scattered along the valley floor. It was a thriving community, a testament to the resilience and perseverance of the human spirit. She rode into the valley, her eyes scanning the scene, her heart filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The people of the valley, seeing the stranger approach, stopped their work and watched her cautiously, their faces wary, their hands hovering near their weapons. Susanna reined in her horse, her hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I mean you no harm," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I am looking for the descendants of the Morales family." The people exchanged glances, their expressions uncertain. An elderly man, his face weathered and lined, his eyes filled with wisdom, stepped forward. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice cautious. "My name is Susanna Carter," she replied. "My father was the man who took this land from your ancestors." A murmur went through the crowd, their faces hardening, their eyes filled with suspicion and resentment. Susanna continued, her voice trembling but firm. "I know I can't undo the wrongs of the past," she said. "But I want to make amends. I want to offer you reparations. This land, it should have been yours." The elderly man studied her, his gaze piercing, searching for any sign of deception. He saw only sincerity, a genuine desire to heal the wounds of the past. "My name is Miguel," he said. "I am the grandson of Rafael Morales, the man your father wronged." He gestured to the valley, to the thriving community, to the people who had built a new life for themselves in this hidden sanctuary. "We have made our peace with the past," Miguel said. "We have found a way to survive, to prosper. We do not need your charity." Susanna shook her head, her eyes filled with tears. "It's not charity," she said. "It's justice. It's what's right." She told them about Garrett, about his sacrifice, about their shared commitment to righting the wrongs of the past. As she spoke, the people of the valley listened, their expressions softening, their hearts touched by her sincerity and her grief. Miguel stepped forward, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "We appreciate your offer, Mrs. Carter," he said, "but we cannot accept it. This land, it is our home now. We have built a new life here. We do not wish to return to the past." He paused, then continued, his voice filled with a quiet strength. "But we can offer you something else. We can offer you forgiveness. And, perhaps, friendship." Susanna's heart swelled with emotion, a mixture of gratitude, relief, and a profound sense of peace. She had found the Morales family, and she had found redemption. The echo of gunfire from the past had faded, but not before one final act. Susanna, with Miguel by her side, turned herself into the new, honest sheriff in a neighboring town. She confessed everything, including her role in covering for Garrett during the raid on the Miller homestead. She implicated Jedediah Stone, providing the sheriff with her father's journal and Elena's testimony. Stone was arrested, his empire crumbling around him. The charges of murder, conspiracy, and land theft would see him imprisoned for the rest of his days. Susanna, however, would only serve a short sentence. The judge, moved by her honesty, her remorse, and Miguel's plea for leniency, showed mercy. The river had brought her to her destiny, and she had chosen the right path. The valley, once a refuge from injustice, now stood as a symbol of hope and reconciliation, a testament to the power of forgiveness and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Chapter 17. A haven built on shifting sands. Susanna's time in prison was short, but transformative. The isolation and confinement forced her to confront her own demons, to grapple with the weight of her past actions, and to contemplate the future she wanted to build. She spent her days reading, reflecting, and writing letters, pouring out her thoughts and feelings, her hopes and regrets, onto the pages of a new journal. She received regular visits from Miguel, who brought her news from the Hidden Valley, updates on the crops, the animals, and the people she had come to care about. He also brought her messages of support and encouragement from the community, a testament to the bond that had formed between them. During one of his visits, Miguel brought her a small, wooden carving of a hawk, a symbol of freedom and resilience, a gift from the children of the valley. Susanna was deeply touched by the gesture, a sign of acceptance, of forgiveness, of a shared hope for a better future. When the day of her release finally arrived, Susanna stepped out of the prison gates, blinking in the bright sunlight, her heart filled with a mixture of trepidation and anticipation. She was greeted by Miguel, who had come to escort her back to the Carter spread. The ride back was filled with a quiet understanding, a shared sense of purpose. Susanna knew that she was returning to a life that had been forever changed, a life without Garrett, a life burdened by the past, but also a life filled with new possibilities. As they approached the ranch, Susanna saw a sight that brought tears to her eyes. The fences had been mended, the corral repaired, and the house had been cleaned and restored. A group of people, residents of the Hidden Valley and some of her own former neighbors, were gathered in the yard, waiting to welcome her home. They greeted her with smiles, hugs, and words of encouragement. They had come together, united by a shared desire to build a better future, to create a community based on trust, cooperation, and mutual respect. Susanna was overwhelmed by their generosity, their kindness, their willingness to forgive and to help. She realized that she was not alone, that she had found a new family, a new community, a new sense of belonging. Over the following weeks and months, Susanna worked tirelessly to rebuild the ranch, to restore it to its former glory, but with a new vision, a new purpose. She implemented sustainable farming practices, shared her resources with her neighbors, and created a haven for those in need. The Carter spread became a symbol of hope, a place where people from different backgrounds, different cultures could come together, work together, and build a better life for themselves and their children. Susanna, inspired by Garrett's memory and guided by her own conscience, dedicated her life to serving others, to promoting justice, to healing the wounds of the past. She became a leader, a mentor, a source of strength and inspiration for the entire community. But even as she built a new life, a new legacy, she never forgot Garrett. She visited his grave regularly, sharing her thoughts and feelings, her triumphs and struggles, with the man she had loved and lost. She often sat beneath the sprawling mesquite tree, watching the sunset, her heart filled with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. She knew that he would be proud of her, proud of the woman she had become, proud of the community she had helped to create. The haven she had built was on shifting sands, on a foundation of past mistakes and present challenges. But it was also built on love, forgiveness, and a shared commitment to a better future. She, the woman who had once held herself at arm's length from the world, was now at its very heart. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, Susanna knew that her journey was far from over, but that she was finally on the right path, a path towards healing, reconciliation, and a lasting peace. Chapter 18. The Ghost of Yesterday's Promises. Years passed, and the Carter spread flourished, a testament to Susanna's resilience, her leadership, and her unwavering commitment to justice and community. The ranch had become a beacon of hope, a place where people from all walks of life could find refuge, support, and a sense of belonging. Susanna, though her hair was now silver and her face lined with the passage of time, remained a force of nature, her spirit undimmed, her determination unwavering. She had become a respected figure in the territory, known for her wisdom, her compassion, and her fierce advocacy for the rights of the marginalized. The memory of Garrett remained a constant presence in her life, a bittersweet reminder of the love she had lost and the sacrifices he had made. She often visited his grave, sharing her thoughts and feelings, her triumphs and struggles, with the man who had changed her life forever. One day, a stranger arrived at the ranch, a young man with a familiar face, a face that stirred something deep within Susanna's memory. He introduced himself as Daniel Coulter, Garrett's nephew. Susanna was stunned, her heart pounding in her chest. She invited Daniel inside, her mind racing, her emotions a whirlwind of surprise, curiosity, and a touch of apprehension. Daniel explained that he had been searching for his uncle for years, following a trail of rumors and whispers, hoping to uncover the truth about his disappearance. He had learned about Garrett's involvement with Susanna and the Carter spread, and he had come seeking answers. Susanna, her voice trembling with emotion, told Daniel the story of his uncle, of his bravery, his sacrifice, his unwavering commitment to justice. She told him about the fight with Jedediah Stone, about Garrett's death, about the legacy he had left behind. Daniel listened intently, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness, pride, and gratitude. He had never known his uncle, but he had always admired him, had always been intrigued by the mystery that surrounded his life. "Thank you," Daniel said, his voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for telling me the truth. Thank you for honoring his memory." Susanna reached out and gently touched his hand, her touch conveying empathy, understanding, and a shared connection to the man they both had loved. "He was a good man, Daniel," Susanna said, her voice soft. "A true hero." Daniel stayed at the ranch for several days, spending time with Susanna, learning about his uncle's life, exploring the land that Garrett had loved and fought for. He visited Garrett's grave, paying his respects, honoring the memory of the man he had never known but had always admired. As Daniel prepared to leave, He turned to Susanna, his eyes filled with a newfound sense of purpose.
"I want to stay," he said, his voice firm.
"I want to help you. I want to continue my uncle's legacy." Susanna was surprised, but also deeply moved by his offer. She had grown accustomed to running the ranch on her own, with the help of the community, but the prospect of having a partner, a family member of Garrett's, to share the burden and the responsibility was appealing. She smiled, her eyes filled with warmth and acceptance. "I would be honored, Daniel," she said. "Welcome to the Carter spread." Daniel's arrival marked a new chapter in Susanna's life, a new beginning filled with hope and promise. The ghost of yesterday's promises, the memory of Garrett, had brought them together, forging a new bond, a new partnership, a new future for the ranch and the community. The legacy was living, and as Susanna and Daniel stood together, looking out over the vast expanse of the Carter spread, they knew that they were not alone, that they had each other, and that together, they would continue to build a better world, a world based on justice, compassion, and a shared commitment to the land and its people. Chapter 19. A Trail of Tears and New Beginnings. Daniel's presence at the Carter spread breathed new life into the ranch and into Susanna's heart. He was a quick learner, eager to absorb everything Susanna could teach him about ranching, about the land, and about the community they served. He possessed Garrett's quiet strength, his innate sense of justice, and his unwavering commitment to doing what was right. Susanna found herself relying on Daniel more and more, delegating responsibilities, seeking his advice, and sharing her hopes and dreams for the future. He became her confidant, her partner, her friend, and a surrogate son, filling the void that Garrett's death had left in her life. Together, they continued to expand the ranch's operations, implementing new sustainable farming practices, improving the living conditions for the workers, and reaching out to neighboring communities, offering assistance and fostering cooperation. The Carter spread became a model of progressive ranching, a testament to the power of collaboration, innovation, and a shared commitment to social responsibility. Susanna and Daniel were recognized throughout the territory for their leadership, their generosity, and their unwavering dedication to building a better world. One day, a group of weary travelers arrived at the ranch, seeking refuge and assistance. They were a small band of Native Americans, the remnants of a tribe that had been displaced from their ancestral lands by the relentless expansion of the American settlers. Susanna and Daniel welcomed them with open arms, offering them food, shelter, and medical care. They listened to their stories, their tales of loss, displacement, and injustice, their hearts filled with compassion and a deep sense of empathy. Susanna, remembering her father's actions and the plight of the Morales family, felt a profound responsibility to help these people, to offer them a safe haven, a place where they could rebuild their lives and preserve their culture. She and Daniel, with the support of the community, decided to allocate a portion of the Carter spread to the tribe, a place where they could establish a new settlement, a place where they could live in peace and dignity. The decision was met with some resistance from a few members of the wider community, people who harbored prejudices and fears about Native Americans. But Susanna and Daniel stood firm, their commitment to justice and equality unwavering. They organized a meeting, bringing together the residents of the Carter spread, the members of the Hidden Valley community, and representatives from the neighboring towns. They spoke passionately about the importance of reconciliation, of healing the wounds of the past, of building a future based on mutual respect and understanding. Their words resonated with the majority of the people, their sincerity and their commitment to justice overcoming the prejudices and fears of the few. The community rallied together, offering their support, their resources, and their labor to help the Native Americans establish their new settlement. The Carter spread became a melting pot of cultures, a place where people from different backgrounds, different traditions, could live together in harmony, learning from each other, supporting each other, and building a stronger, more vibrant community. The Trail of Tears, the path of displacement and suffering, had led to a new beginning, a place of hope, healing, and reconciliation. Susanna, guided by the memory of Garrett and inspired by the resilience of the human spirit, had created a legacy that would endure for generations to come. The land would carry these stories. And as she looked out over the thriving community, a mix of faces, cultures, and dreams, she knew that she had finally found peace, that she had honored her promises, and that she had built a world where justice, compassion, and love prevailed. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. Years melted into decades. The Carter spread, once a symbol of struggle and solitude, blossomed into a vibrant testament to community, resilience, and the enduring power of forgiveness. Susanna, her hair now completely white, her body frail but her spirit as fiery as ever, remained the heart and soul of the ranch, her wisdom and compassion guiding its continued growth and evolution. Daniel, now a seasoned rancher himself, had married a woman from the Hidden Valley, Elena, a descendant of the Morales family. They had children, a new generation growing up on the land, a generation that knew nothing of the conflicts and injustices of the past, a generation raised on the principles of equality, cooperation, and respect for all. The Native American settlement, nestled within the boundaries of the Carter spread, thrived, their culture and traditions preserved and celebrated, their people integrated into the wider community, their contributions valued and respected. The ranch had become a model for the entire territory, a shining example of how diverse groups of people could live together in harmony, building a better future for themselves and their children. Susanna and Daniel had received numerous accolades, their work recognized by government officials, community leaders, and even by the descendants of some of those who had once opposed them. One day, a letter arrived, an unexpected communication that stirred up a mix of emotions within Susanna's heart. It was from a lawyer representing the estate of Jedediah Stone, who had died in prison a few years earlier. The letter stated that Stone, in his final days, had expressed a desire to make amends for his past actions. He had left a small parcel of land, a piece of property adjacent to the Carter spread, to Susanna as a gesture of remorse and reconciliation. Susanna was stunned, her mind reeling with a complex array of feelings. She had never expected such a gesture from Stone, the man who had caused her so much pain, the man who had been responsible for Garrett's death. She discussed the letter with Daniel and Elena, seeking their advice, their perspective. They were equally surprised, but they encouraged Susanna to accept the offer, to see it as an opportunity to finally close a painful chapter in her life, to bring closure to the long and bitter conflict that had defined so much of her past. Susanna, after much contemplation, decided to accept the land. She knew it wouldn't bring Garrett back, it wouldn't erase the pain of the past, but it could serve as a symbol of healing, of forgiveness, of a final reconciliation. She decided to donate the land to the Native American settlement, a gesture of solidarity, a way to further strengthen the bonds between the different communities that called the Carter spread home. The news of Susanna's decision was met with widespread approval, a testament to her unwavering commitment to justice and her ability to transcend even the most bitter of rivalries. On a clear, crisp autumn day, a ceremony was held to mark the transfer of the land. The entire community gathered, representatives from the Carter spread, the Hidden Valley, the Native American settlement, and even some from the neighboring towns. Susanna, standing tall and proud, despite her advanced years, spoke to the assembled crowd, her voice filled with emotion and wisdom. This land, she said, her voice resonating across the valley, represents more than just acres and boundaries. It represents a journey from conflict to cooperation, from hatred to understanding, from despair to hope. She spoke of Garrett, of his sacrifice, of his unwavering belief in justice. She spoke of the Morales family, of their resilience, their forgiveness, their willingness to build a new life. She spoke of the Native Americans, of their strength, their traditions, their enduring connection to the land. We have come a long way, she said. We have learned from our mistakes. We have built a community based on respect, on compassion, on a shared commitment to a better future. She paused, her eyes sweeping across the faces of the people gathered before her, a diverse mix of ages, cultures, and backgrounds. The final confrontation, she said, her voice filled with a profound sense of peace, is not between enemies. but between hearts. And it is with open hearts, with understanding and forgiveness, that we can truly conquer the horizons before us. Her words hung in the air, a testament to the power of reconciliation, a beacon of hope for a future where justice, compassion, and love prevailed. It was time to move on. The ceremony concluded with a shared meal, a celebration of unity, a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. The final confrontation had been won, not with guns or violence, but with forgiveness, understanding, and a shared commitment to building a better world. Epilogue. The sun set on the Carter spread, painting the sky in hues of orange, purple, and gold. Susanna, now well into her 90s, sat on the porch of the ranch house, a blanket wrapped around her frail shoulders, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. The ranch bustled with activity, the sounds of children laughing, cattle lowing, and horses neighing filling the air. Daniel and Elena's children, now young adults, were taking on more and more responsibility, ensuring the continued success and sustainability of the operation. The Native American settlement was thriving, their culture and traditions flourishing, their people integrated into the wider community, their contributions valued and respected. The Hidden Valley remained a sanctuary, a place of peace and tranquility, a testament to the resilience and perseverance of the Morales family descendants. Susanna smiled, her heart filled with a profound sense of contentment. She had lived a long and full life, a life marked by hardship, loss, and struggle, but also by love, forgiveness, and triumph. She had faced down her demons, atoned for the sins of her father, and built a legacy that would endure for generations to come. She had created a community, a haven, a place where people from all walks of life could live together in harmony, working towards a common goal, building a better future for themselves and their children. She thought of Garrett, her heart aching with a bittersweet nostalgia. She knew he would be proud of her, proud of the woman she had become, proud of the world she had helped to create. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Susanna closed her eyes, her breathing slowing, her body relaxing. She felt a sense of peace, a sense of completion, a sense of having fulfilled her destiny. She had followed the river, where it bent towards destiny, and she had found what she was seeking: justice, redemption, and a love that transcended time and space. Her spirit, as free as the hawk that soared above the Carter spread, finally took flight, joining Garrett in the vast expanse of the eternal sky. The land remained, a testament to her life, her love, and her enduring legacy. The ranch, the people, the intertwined stories would continue. But Susanna Carter, the woman who had defied the odds, who had fought for justice, who had built a haven of hope, was finally at rest. The end.